Hello all, my name is Elizabeth Bleynat. I am a second year MFA. Just because there's sometimes some confusion, I am in the studio arts program, not the arts and ecology program. Today, I am going to talk to you a little bit about my art practice, our recent show, Dane Curum, or Take Care, and what I'm exploring moving forward into this final semester of the program. We chose the name Dane Curum because through all of our practices runs an aspect of nurturing. I'm sure that Francine and Tiffani will talk to you about how their practices embody this, but for me, I am focusing on environmental care through addressing aspects of the marine plastic crisis. I did not grow up close to the sea. While I am from a coastal state, North Carolina, I am from Asheville, which for those of you who are not familiar, is in the far west, a 6 or 7 hour drive from the coast. It is in the mountains, it is beautiful, but I'm not sure that I ever thought of or saw a ship outside of maybe, movies about pirates until I was in my 20s. I, in fact, in my young adult years, moved even further from the sea when I went to Sewanee, the University of the South, for my bachelor's. After completing my bachelor's, I went to Hong Kong to work in the maritime human rights area. And for the first time, I became intricately aware of how much sea transport and the labor of people working at sea affect our lives. In fact, over 90% of goods worldwide are transported by sea. And for countries like Ireland, like the UK, like the US, pretty much any European or Western developed nation, the numbers are much higher. I believe that Ireland, I'm not positive about this, receives more imports of fruits and vegetables than any other nation in the EU. My role as a human rights advocate at sea required me to board about 3 to 4 vessels every day in the Hong Kong Anchorage area and speak to the people, almost entirely men, on board and find out what their working conditions were so that if there were issues on board, such as they were not receiving relief from their contract, or they were not being paid, or they were not being fed, I interceded on their behalf with representatives from the United Nations, which is the only organization that really even mildly oversees maritime law, and it is done poorly, and it is difficult to regulate. While in Hong Kong, I started to become increasingly aware of marine plastic as an issue because I could see it. I'd always cared about recycling and reducing single-use plastics, all of these things, but something always sticks more strongly with you when you see it. However, I had focused my advocacy on the area that corporations such as PepsiCo, McDonald's would like me to focus on, which is on consumer plastics. Bags, bottles, straws. But what I didn't know, and actually only learned since moving to the Burren, is that almost half of the plastic that is in the ocean is from fishing. It is from abandoned nets, from bait bags, from all kinds of lines. They are cut free and left in the sea. This is problematic on so many levels, as you might imagine, for the marine mammals, for schools of fish, they are trapped. This breaks up the food system. It's devastating on all levels of the ocean ecosystem. And then microplastics, once they are broken down, they are maybe the most dangerous of these things because they enter the water table, they enter the food system, they prevent proper carbon sequestration by the ocean, because the algae and other such photosynthesizing things that will take in the carbon and then sink to the bottom of the ocean floor, where it's then sequestered, float. And so the carbon suck of the ocean has been destroyed in many ways. So I also learned since moving here that plastic is now in human bodies from our earliest stages of development. There was a research group in Rome that examined placentas of 4 healthy pregnancies, and they found that there were microplastics on both the maternal and fetal side of the placenta. So I started to think about how do you depict finding nutrition around plastic or through plastic rather than finding plastic in nutrition, because we are now, it is now impossible to not eat microplastics. It does not matter how careful you are with your shopping. If you grow it yourself, they're ubiquitous. We are breathing them, we are eating them, we are growing with them, they are bioaccumulating in all of us. So I started making this mask series last year, and I would take these masks and I'd either wear them or I would eat puddings made from foraged seaweeds through them, thinking about how even in this most local indigenous plant, these particles were present. And then I kind of have started to move away from the wearable sculpture, which leads me to the first piece that I'm going to talk about, Draft 1 from the show Den Curran. Draft 1 is comprised of several key bits. The bottles are collected from my home, from the general BCA community. I put out a call and said, if you're going to use plastic, please drop it off with me for my art material. And I built this rack, and as you can see, it holds weight. There are maybe some things, you know, doing it again that I would do a little differently in its construction and its display, but I call it Raft 1 for a reason. I'm planning on making more. Here's a detail shot. Something that's important in my practice is considering how we can pull more value out of existent goods. To my mind, any viable climate plan has to include retrieving plastics that are already within the system, especially before they can break down into microplastics, because the potential is there for, even if we were to completely stop the production of new plastics, for this to be a persistent health problem that runs for the rest of the course of humanity, however long that may be. The second piece from this show that I want to talk about is some sea floating board. I made this piece is sort of site specific. I didn't really plan it until about a week before we were opening. It is made up of many pieces of found plastic that either I collected or that other people from the Burren College of Art community brought to me. For me, this piece was largely successful in the space. There's a kinetic aspect that every time a door opened or closed, or people walked by it, it would move the work, it would spin, feeding the shadow that you see there. The mirror is a component that I think serves both as a little bit of a condemnation, but also a warning. And I more want to lean into the warning side of it, but I'm afraid that the condemnation comes through more clearly. Because when my viewer leans over the mirror, they see themselves amongst the plastic. So there are things like, you know, plastic bottles and bits of rope. And, you know, I was trying to show the different layers of plastic that exist within the sea. But I think more it just shows the sheer volume of human waste in the environment. So I think I want to move, you know, towards using more objects like these, the buoy and the bait bag, rather than objects like these, the water bottle, the toothpaste tube, and the frog from the Kinder Egg. Back towards the fishing and maritime waste. So now I'm back in the studio, and well, I guess I sort of treat the beach a little bit like my studio too. Just a few days ago, my partner and I found this rope that I haven't measured yet, but I think altogether might be about 40 meters lying out on the beach. Somebody clearly cut it free and left it in the environment. So I'm very happy to have it for my art material, but I am disturbed that such a valuable and usable good was so freely abandoned. It definitely speaks to the culture of disposability, both of objects and also of people in the fishing and maritime industry. I'm considering how to better combine organic materials, whatever that means, and plastics in my work, as I think so much of what I want to speak about is how we and the other animals in the animal kingdom are becoming more and more plastic, and it is not, there's no longer a thing that is separate from us, it is part of us. And so I am cleaning wool and cleaning plastic, and I will probably felt and sew them together to some extent. I have some other pieces in the work that I haven't started cleaning materials for. And then I guess really my question for myself this semester is about microplastics. How do I visually depict a largely invisible problem? Microplastic, by definition, is smaller than 5 millimeters. You can't really see it. So I don't think I'm going to be collecting and working with microplastics. I don't think I'm going to be making the plastics that I have found into microplastics, because that's dangerous. I could take an X-Acto knife. But Earth operates on geologic time. It will eventually recover from us, but we won't if we don't act quickly to remove these biohazards from the environment and repurpose them and give them value as material. This is where I believe that global ecofeminists and craftspeople will have some part in leading the charge in how we view these materials. Such things as, you know, quilting and rag rugs and all forms of craft have forever found value in waste goods, and that is where we need to move on the plastic front. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and attention. I haven't met all of you yet, but I would really love and welcome any feedback and criticism for how I can make my art practice better. So say anything in the question and answer session later, and feel free to come find me in my studio and talk to me. Thank you. Up next is Tiffani.
Okay. All right, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here and spending your morning with us today. Um, oh, is it okay? Yeah, let me know if you can't hear me. I know I speak softly. Um, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Tiffani Love. I'm in my second year of the MFA Studio Art program. Through my talk today, I'll share with you a background about myself and where I came from and what led me to the Burren. I'll then give you a brief overview of my practice and what I was working on in my first year at the Burren. And lastly, I'll discuss my research into my latest work, which is an ongoing series of paintings based on the Rhine, which was exhibited in our recent show, Dame Curran, Take Care, here at the College Gallery. So who am I? I'm a landscape painter working mostly with oil paint. My draw to the landscape as subject is undoubtedly because of my background and the region where I grew up. I'm originally from northern New York, way up in New York State near the Adirondack Mountains. It's a similar place to the Burren in that it's a rural area. You can walk out your door and be immersed in nature. I spent my adolescence in a home in the woods within earshot of the Racket River. It was mighty cold in the winter, but it was an incredible place to connect with the landscape. During those years, I spent a lot of time hiking in the mountains and walking trails in the woods. And I've since learned that the greatest gift I got from living in northern New York through all those icy cold winters was an incredible delight in the gift of simply being in nature and creating an attunement to place. So fast forward to my time in the Burren. I moved to the Burren in August of 2020, in the middle of the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. I spent my first semester trying to form a connection to this place, to my new home. But as many of you know, forming such a connection often takes a long time. It can take months or even years. So midway through my first semester here in October of 2020, there was an onslaught of new restrictions in Ireland as when we went into a further lockdown. I was inspired by the onset of the 5-kilometer radius restriction to map my 5-kilometer radius onto a section of Tim Robinson's Burren map, which you see here. This 5-kilometer radius gave me new limitations to work with in my practice. I used Robinson's map to understand my local area better, and the marked ring forts, paths, and holy wells gave me places to search for on my daily walks, places I might not have even known existed if I hadn't spent this time looking at its maps. So in my second semester, my scope broadened a bit. I was still painting County Clare, but I was looking further down the coast. This was a great semester for my painting practice to loosen up in the culmination of a large-scale painting, which I worked on just simply stretched onto the wall, stapled onto the wall in my studio. For this painting, I used new implements to make it. I used larger brushes that I got from the hardware store. I used scrap pieces of cardboard that I had in my studio, even scrap pieces of wood and my fingers sometimes just to apply the paint to the canvas. However, with all of that, my subject was feeling a little lost. I had chosen a place to paint that was a bit too far away that I couldn't visit it regularly. So I learned from this, and I knew that when I moved into my second year, I needed to have a subject that was close enough to home that I could visit often, a place I could go and observe many times over to get a true understanding of the place. in order to hone my painting skills while also creating meaningful work. So I know I've kind of touched on this already, but I'd like to take a moment now to discuss why walking the landscape is important to my practice. I've shown you so far that I use walking as a way to learn about a place. I spend time walking in the landscape alone because it allows me to form a connection to my environment. My paintings are a reflection of my personal experience of a place, and therefore it is essential for me to physically spend time in the landscapes that I choose to depict in my paintings. Walking in the landscape provides me with a firsthand experience of place, and it has the advantage that it's a very slow form of locomotion. You can't get this slowness with other forms of transportation like running or cycling or driving a car through a landscape. So for myself, a landscape painter, the slow pace of walking is one of the main reasons why I prefer this mode of transportation. By walking, there's a heightened potential for me to feel a closeness and connection to my environment. While I am walking amongst a landscape, I am moving with it, my body becoming part of this landscape in motion. Through walking, there is a greater likelihood I will notice the subtle shifts of a place compared to if I was running, cycling, or driving a car in the same place. So I quite like the way artist Nick Miller explains his experience of painting in an interview he did with Donald Maguire of the National Gallery of Ireland. He said, "Painting is a very physical thing for me. It's how you hold the energy of the world you meet in 2 dimensions. So you have to let it into you, and then you have to release it into paint." As an artist working with the landscape, Miller speaks to the importance of interacting with the subject in a habitual manner. Through this interaction with the subject, in this case landscape, there is an exchange of energy, first between the subject and the artist, then between the artist and paint. In my practice, I have experienced such an exchange of energy. Through my research, I have found that routine engagement leads to a more comprehensive understanding of a place. It opens the opportunity for a longer and more in-depth conversation between artist and subject. And therefore, the more engagement with subject, the greater exchange of energy. At the start of last semester, I was working to find a place to use as my subject, spending a lot of time outside walking and researching, looking for a place that demanded my attention. Rather serendipitously, I found myself at the Rhine one morning just before sunrise. And for anyone who's not familiar with the Rhine, it's that little bit of land you see there. It's located just west of Ballyvaughan village, and it sticks out on the south side of Galway Bay. So I had visited the Rhine many times over the previous year and a half living here. But it wasn't until that morning on the Rhine that it struck me as a place I needed to paint. So I'd now like to take a closer look at the paintings I made for our exhibition, Dane Perm Take Care. The show was both a culmination of the work made in the studio last semester and a way for us to test ideas in the gallery space. I had decided relatively early on in the semester that I wanted to make 3 larger scale paintings for the show, which in the end I was able to finish, alongside a series of 3 smaller works. All the work I made for the exhibition was in reference to my research at the Rhine. So throughout the semester, I engaged in a routine walking practice, visiting the Rhine countless times. To plan my walks, I consulted the tide charts for Galway Bay, often planning the walks to align with certain tide height. So I was looking at the Rhine as a liminal space because it's such a thin strip of land protruding into the bay. It's flanked by the sea on either side, and quite a dramatic change in the landscape occurs as the tide ebbs and flows. I found myself most interested in the tide when it was nearing its highest point throughout the monthly tidal cycle. For example, in the painting here, the first of the three larger paintings in the show, I caught the tide as it was approaching the highest point that day. The seawater was rising up through the cracks in the rock you see there. And eventually, within 30 minutes or so, that entire plain is completely flooded with water. So as a landscape painter, I place a high importance on conveying an honest and authentic representation of my subject. For me, an authentic representation becomes more accessible when I build a stronger relationship with the places in my painting. So authentic representation does not always translate into photorealist representation for me. Rather, my paintings are a translation of my sensorial experience of place. The paintings do normally resemble the place to some degree, showing accurate depiction of the contours of the terrain, but there is always more there. My experience is imbued within the pieces, often shown through certain color choices and what I leave in, what I take out. So this piece here, the second of my three larger paintings, I was thinking a lot about the season, the time of year, and my feeling of the place at that time. The reference for this painting was an image from November. Looking at the Burren landscape in November, you see a lot of kind of death and decay. And I found while I was looking on my walks, I was really drawn to those orangey hues you see in certain slices of the land. And maybe I was searching for warmth in the creamy yellow sky, seeing through what's approaching. But to me, this painting feels like that time and place for me. And I hope when others view it, it invites some sort of new feeling or brings you towards a different place that you might not have experienced before. So onto the third larger painting I made for the show. The Rhine has these pools of water dotted throughout the landscape, and they actually fill during the high tide when the plains flood. And I kind of view them as portals. So one such pool is here. So even after the tide retreats, the pools are left behind, often for hours before the water drains down through the earth. And you can even kneel down to the ground and listen to the water as it's draining down through. I recommend you do that sometime. So the tide not only weaves together land and sea, but it's a place as well. I'm able to reflect on this experience when I return to the studio. And through the use of oil paint on canvas with carefully chosen color and physical brushwork, I express this connection to place. So the Rhine has taught me a lot about the landscape and the coast here thus far. It taught me how to break down the coast into different elements, and I now understand it better. And while it's a relatively small area, there's a lot to study there and a lot to see, and I don't quite feel like I've given it the time it deserves yet. So this semester, I plan to continue working with the Rhine and creating some new work based off of it. And I look forward to sharing that with you all come April at our time. So thanks, guys. And now moving on to Francine.
Taking off my hat now. I think someone's speaker's on.
For those of you in Zoom land, can you make sure to mute yourselves?
Maybe it's me. Maybe I'm making noise.
Kelly, can you make sure to mute your wait, mute your screen? Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Hello. So I just want to thank Elizabeth and Tiffany for sharing their concepts and work with us. For those of you who do not know me personally, my name is Francine Marquis. I'm an interdisciplinary artist here on my second year at the Burren College of Art. For my presentation, I would like to spend this time talking about my work, A Wall to Place, shown in the recent exhibition in the BCA Gallery, entitled Denk Kurm, Take Care. Rather than discussing the totality of the work, I'll be exploring the material language I used to produce it. Before arriving to the Burren, my early education began with literary prose, various forms of casting, construction, and sculptural ceramic works. My practice has always been focused on process, whatever the material, and the stages, in no particular direction. Inspired by the cities and towns I lived in, and moving often, I soon realized that the idea of permanence did not exist. Cities hold a great arcade of architectural shells, but whether living in the neons of urban sprawl or the cookie cutters of suburbia, they all share various forms of abandonments. Some due to financial collapse or poor building materials, others too old to maintain, or partially damaged from human intervention or upheaval. These places of disrepair or neglect interested me. The liminal realm of being and ending, built or in a state of disrepair, all read as a monument to decay, as if to remind one of the inevitability of time. Admittedly, I'm not the first artist to be drawn to these remnants. For countless centuries, inspiration has been drawn from the ruin aesthetic. Gordon Matta Clark, an American artist whom I reflect on and admire, was well versed in the temporality of buildings. He called his practice of reconstruction and architecture, which he performed on buildings slated for demolition, as you can see here. However, where Matta Clark splits, interjects, and dissects, I work to construct, craft, and explore. I am not recreating or copying these buildings of personal memory or experience, more so they're fragments, debris as a mutation of in-betweens. It isn't a ruin, nor is it a building site. This uncertainty, the memories which are embedded and revealed, give the installation, the place, an experience unique to the audience. The vocabulary of my material practice is as follows: place, sculpted architectural installations, experience, or the phenomenology of place, being in it, the audience's engagement with the work, and memory, which I see as entropy, corrosion, assemblage, layers, and movement. If I was to ask for each of you to recount a memory of a room you've lived in or even occupied for a brief time, it is more often than not tied to the experience of being in the place, our sensorial experience of both the memory and where it is housed, physical attributes of what the room smelled like, how the wind moved through the building, what textured the walls. I hold a memory of my sister and I hiding while an open house was taking place in our childhood home. I recall tucking myself beneath my bed as the realtor moved the group about the rooms, casually noting its various architectural charms. This vivid memory, feeling the rough synthetic carpet scraping at my knees and elbows, and the bold feeling of marking a small portion of the wall in hopes of leaving something behind for the next child who call this room home. It isn't a unique story. Innumerable memories are etched into the walls, ceilings, and floors of the interior spaces we engage with daily. When I was creating this series, I was not worried about the accuracy of my own memories. There isn't a need for it. It almost hinders it. Though I'm casting, replicating, it's entirely about the unattainable perfection and permanence that draws me to reference lived spaces. What I see is aging, fluid nature of memory reflects back to the broken and exposed and the layered. By the removal of materials, my materials, the materials I work with and engage in my studio, I'm expressing this theory. In the series entitled A Wall to Place, I've worked as I would a factory. I casted 87 plaster floorboards, 219 wax tiles from 9 different master molds in true assembly fashion. As I mentioned, casting is a form of encapsulation. In my attempts to create an exact replica, in this process and scale of mass production, I not only mimic ideas' stability, but monumentalize it. I am layering my work with the physical representation of another. The only divergence is my choice in the material. Both plaster and wax are easily altered materials, especially if casted thin, treaded on, or melted. The plaster boards in the entryway of the gallery were placed down with the intention of participatory ruin, highlighting the present moments, distance, pulled from writer Brian Dillon. My plan was to engage with my audience. I wanted their experience of the work to be a collaboration with it. The themes of corrosion and fracture are continuously part of my process. But I wanted an access point for the viewer to become the maker. Once installed, the work still remains incomplete. It's a bit like the ship you crack the celebratory champagne on before it sails. This engagement with the work, this engagement from my audience, makes me feel like there is some kind of conversation that continues through the work. It doesn't end with the installation, and it doesn't end with its deinstallation. It's continuously in flux, much like memory. Memory. In the center of the floating wall installation, you are faced with a large break or gash, if you will. I would say that here is where an interesting thing happened. With various forms of entropy present in each of my installations, this was the most, though I hate using the word describing my work, aggressive act. However, there's little information of it. There's nothing left. The plasterboards lay cracked and dusted in both the entryway and exit of the building. The wax wall and floor tiles melted or snapped where pressure was applied. But evidence of this specific fracture wasn't there. The reason for this was care. I wanted the disrepair of the object to be missing. I wanted the storyline to be jagged and skipped. The removal of the material was done in my studio prior to the install, with the skim coating only applied after the break was made. Thus the edges are manufactured and manicured, much more sculpted. I wanted the initial experience to be worry, then perhaps lead to the question of why and how. By these choices, the wall becomes a prop. It embodies the monument. My material language is aged mediums, the aged interior of lived space. I find the emotional connection to place is felt in the loss of it. As I said before, its mutation. The permeations of architectural space. As I mentioned earlier, I have a strong background in writing. I often find that thematic threads weave their way into all aspects of an artist's work and daily rituals. For me, words are the same as any other sculptural material. Just like my casts, I reference the familiar to disjoint. I ask my audience to question what the words represent personally versus their classic definition. In the next slide, I'll share with you a poem, which I'll read aloud, but please feel free to read along. It's important with my writing that you pay attention to each choice of word. I try to trick you. Brought to morning, brought to place, and paste yourself to it, plastered in, built to weather storm, a fortitude much like the skull, a six-wall plain, plain and milled, factory setting and how-tos, remembered smells, recalling various corners and cold feet on the floor of some late hour. Age unknown. Memory pinned to a project board, skin, tissue, and nerve. Monumented to the liminal. Framed. I read a sign resting at an angle that doesn't suit. Construction site. As the cracks down. Thank you. I hope you enjoy it.